Harvard. The president stood by his statement.
All right, Julia Benbrook, thank you so much. Lots of questions still remain. We want to bring in Bradley Devlin right now. He is the politics editor at the Daily Signal. Bradley, good morning. Good to see you on this Tuesday morning. The Trump administration cutting, I want to continue on that same vein with Harvard University. So the Trump administration cutting over $2 billion in funding to Harvard. Other universities are also pushing back. What sort of message does this send to other institutions? Because still the question is, and the administration is asking this, and a lot of other people are asking this now, what countries are providing so much money to these institutions? Why are these institutions admitting so many international students? And the other question that's coming up this morning is, are these countries pushing these institutions to push back on the administration?
Yeah, I think first the message is follow the law. It's a very simple message from the administration. The number one problem with Harvard and Ivy Leagues like it and other institutions of higher education is that they have pursued hiring policies and admissions policies that have absolutely flouted U.S. law. They are violating and discriminating against American citizens, in the case of favoring foreign applicants on the basis of race or national origin. And I think that is the number one factor here. When you look at the demands from the Trump administration, it's not, Harvard wants to say that it's just curriculum based. And then, of course, they slide in, oh, and also the process by which we hire our teachers or our administrators. Well, if that process of which they're hiring administrators and teachers violates the law of the United States, discriminates against people, then absolutely the government should take a proactive role in making sure that federal funds, i.e. taxpayer dollars, aren't going towards that type of activity, aren't going towards those types of policies.
Okay, so that makes sense. We'll continue to watch that in terms of how the administration responds, how those universities respond and continue to fight this. I do want to turn back to immigration. And based on what we heard from the Oval Office yesterday from both President Trump and President Bukele, I want to kind of break this down for our viewers because there was some information that was missing earlier. So I want to go a little bit deeper in this. It doesn't sound like Abrego Garcia will be sent back to the U.S. anytime soon. So we remember the Trump administration was only ordered to facilitate his return, the operative word there being facilitate, which according to Attorney General Pam Bondi consists of essentially providing a plane. Now, El Salvador says they won't release a quote unquote domestic terrorist into the country. And we heard the president says he's not going, the president of El Salvador says he's not going to smuggle a domestic terrorist into the United States. The administration pointed out yesterday, Bradley, that 2 judges have previously ruled that this man should be deported, that he is part of MS-13 and he is in our country illegally. So help us understand, why are judges still fighting this? Why are we still going back to the same back and forth? And is the administration on solid ground here or no?
Yeah, well, let's first start with the essential question, which is this tension between the executive and the judiciary. This has existed for the entirety of our republic's history. Of course, the judiciary wants to provide a check on the powers of the president. And in certain cases, the judiciary, by providing checks on the executive and the legislature, have actually tried to take those powers away from the executive and away from the Congress, legislating from the bench. We've heard this a lot with Roe v. Wade, right? That, of course, is not how the executive and the Congress want to do business in Washington, D.C., because they want to protect their own power and their own institution. And so you're going to have this massive amount of friction between a vigorous executive and the courts. I think the Supreme Court struck an important balance here, which is the facilitation of the release, as Pam Bondi said, Attorney General Pam Bondi said, is not that they can declare sovereignty over an El Salvadorian citizen now in El Salvador. That's ludicrous. And the idea that the judiciary can come in and tell the executive to turn planes around, for example, when that judge has no idea what the fuel level of those planes are, bringing violent gang members from the United States to El Salvador. I mean, that seems ludicrous on its face, but now the judiciary decides that they're going to have a district court judge again, right, decides that it's going to have power over what the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, does with one of his own citizens. This seems ridiculous on its face if you just look a little bit deeper past the surface. Of course, there has been blunders by the administration on this front. They have put the attorney that argued this case in front of the judge originally on administrative leave because, as Stephen Miller has said, they had told the court that this was a mistake in deporting this individual, but there was no mistake to be had, the administration says. It's standing strong on that. It's saying that this man was arrested in 2019 for having immigration violations, and once again in March as a suspected MS-13 gang member. So that's I think how we can understand this, is that the nature of checks and balances isn't that everyone goes along and gets along. There's going to be fights all of the time. And those fights are often for the betterment of the American people, because President Trump, like it or not, is the only elected official in the country that has been elected by the entirety of the American people, whereas district court judges, and yes, the Supreme Court, have not been elected by the people.
You know, it's interesting you brought that up because the administration did come out and say that they, instead of sending him to another country other than El Salvador, an administrative error led to him being deported to El Salvador rather than being deported somewhere else. But again, the question, the Supreme Court also ruled that the lower court has no power over the president in foreign policy. So again, I guess it's a two-part question. Why is the media, other media, not talking about that? And why are we back at this back and forth? It seems as though it's clear. Is it not a clear ruling? I mean, are we missing something?
Well, Fanchon, I mean, yeah, I think the ruling is particularly clear, but you have to remember that this is the sacred cow of the corporate media. This is how they cozy up to their friends in the business and the political community by advocating for immigration policies that undermine the safety of American neighborhoods, that undermine the wages of American workers, and that pad the pockets of Wall Street. This is why they're freaking out about tariffs, right? We talk about the exchange of goods and services, but oftentimes we don't talk enough about labor as a market. That is one of the major reasons why, you know, tariffs, when China joined the WTO, for example, tariffs lowered about 5% on the U.S. side to China, opening up the U.S. market to Chinese imports. But what business leaders saw was an arbitrage opportunity in the labor market, and so they took their factories over to China. The inverse can still be the same thing, where labor comes in from foreign countries who are willing to work for under-the-table wages in the United States. And so what that does is, of course, as I said before, undercut the wage of the American worker. It's not that Americans won't do these jobs. That is one of the are myths that the American media perpetrate, and then they do things like this, advocating for the return of a man who's a MS-13 gang member because they are afraid that this is another domino to fall in the end of the neoliberal immigration regime, right? So they propagate these types of narratives in order to say that Americans won't do these factory jobs. They won't do these construction jobs. Well, they won't do these construction jobs for under-the-table wages. That's not the American deal. That's not the American bargain. What the American worker wants is a fair wage for a fair day's work and some strong benefits to make sure that if something happens to them or their families, they can make sure that they make the next month's rent payment. So I think it's despicable what the media does with examples like this to try to completely tear apart the common sense immigration policy off the backs of 4 years of completely unfettered, uncontrolled immigration that, yes, included, as President Trump said in 2015 and said repeatedly again on the campaign trail leading up to the 2024 election, rapists, murderers, and terrorists into the United States.
Well, Bradley, I appreciate you breaking this down because our viewers can see it for themselves, because much of the media is still omitting critical details in this story. And it's very disheartening because it hurts our public and it hurts our viewers when they don't get the full story. So I appreciate you bringing the context and adding so much detail to what actually should be included in every story that is reported by all media. So we appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you, Fanch.